I never thought my gas bill would become grounds for a lawsuit. But here I was, staring at a fluorescent orange violation notice taped to my front door in the middle of February in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The paper flapped in the bitter wind as I ripped it down, my fingers already going numb despite my gloves. $50 fine for excessive utility usage creating visual pollution. I read it 3 times before the words actually made sense, and even then, they didn't make sense at all. Visual pollution. From my heater, I stormed inside my townhouse, slamming the door behind me. The warmth hit me immediately, my glasses fogging up as I kicked off my boots. I had moved into the Riverside Meadows community 6 months ago, lured by the reasonable HOA fees and the promise of well-maintained common areas. What I hadn't counted on was Brenda Hutchinson, the HOA president who apparently had nothing better to do than monitor everyone's exhaust vents. My phone buzzed. A text from my neighbor Marcus. "Dude, did you get one too?" I replied quickly. "Yeah, what the hell is visual pollution? Your heater exhaust. Brenda says the white vapor makes the building look industrial and uninviting. Check the HOA email." I pulled up my laptop, still wearing my coat, and opened the email that had apparently been sent at 6 in the morning. The subject line read, "Urgent, new environmental aesthetic standards." The email was 3 pages long. I skimmed through Brenda's overwrought prose about maintaining property values and community standards until I reached the relevant section. Apparently, the board had passed a new rule 2 days ago limiting the amount of visible exhaust vapor allowed from individual units. The limit was so low that it basically meant you couldn't run your heater above 65 degrees when the outside temperature dropped below freezing. It was currently 18 degrees outside. I called the HOA office immediately. The phone rang 6 times before Brenda's nasally voice answered. "Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association, this is Brenda speaking." "Brenda, this is Xavier Barrett from Unit 42. I just got a violation notice about my heater." "Oh yes, Mr. Barrett. Your exhaust was producing significant vapor clouds this morning, very unsightly." "It's 18 degrees outside. Of course there's vapor. That's how condensation works. The new environmental aesthetic standards were voted on and approved by the board. You should have attended the meeting if you wanted to voice concerns. The meeting was at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday." "I was at work. Most people were at work." "That's not the board's problem, Mr. Barrett. The standards are in effect and you've been fined. You can pay online or mail a check. Have a nice day." She hung up before I could respond. I sat there, staring at my phone, rage building in my chest. I had bought this place specifically because the HOA seemed reasonable. The fees were only $200 a month, which covered landscaping, snow removal, and maintenance of the community center. The community center was actually the nicest part of the whole complex, a large building with a meeting room, a small gym, and a lounge area. The board held their monthly meetings there, and residents could reserve it for parties or events. The meeting room was heated by a system that pulled from units on either side of the building. My unit was one of them. I had discovered this when I was reviewing the building plans before I bought the place. The heating system was old and quirky, designed back in the 80s when the complex was built. Essentially, the meeting room didn't have its own dedicated furnace. Instead, it had a supplemental heating system that drew warm air from 4 connected units, mine included, through a shared duct system. Our individual heating bills were supposedly adjusted to compensate, though I had my doubts about how accurate that was. An idea started forming in my mind. It was petty. It was probably childish. But after 6 months of Brenda's increasingly ridiculous rules, including a ban on wind chimes, restrictions on what color doormats we could use, and a requirement that all packages be brought inside within 2 hours of delivery or face a fine. I was done playing nice. I looked up the board meeting schedule. The next meeting was in 5 days, on Thursday evening at 7 p.m. It was supposed to be a big one too, the annual budget meeting where they decided how to allocate funds for the year. I pulled up the HVAC system documentation I had saved and started reading through the technical specifications. The shared heating system had individual shutoff valves in each connected unit. The valves were installed so that homeowners could isolate their systems for maintenance without affecting the others. If I closed my valve, my unit would stop contributing heat to the meeting room, but the room would still get some warmth from the other 3 connected units. Unless, of course, those other 3 units also closed their valves. I called Marcus first. He lived in Unit 39, one of the other connected units. "Marcus, how pissed off are you about this heater fine?" "Extremely. Jennifer is livid. She's already drafting an email to the board." "I have a better idea. You know how the meeting room heating works," vaguely. "Something about shared ducts." I explained the system to him, then outlined my plan. There was a long pause. "Xavier, that's diabolical." "Is that a yes?" "Hell yes. Who else do we need?" Unit 36 and Unit 47. That's Alina Rodriguez and Tom Chen. Alina got fined last month for having a wreath on her door outside of designated holiday decoration season. She'll be in. I don't know Tom as well. I'll talk to Alina. Can you reach out to Tom on it? I knocked on Alina's door 20 minutes later. She answered wearing paint-stained overalls, her dark hair tied back in a ponytail. She was an artist who worked from home, and I could hear music playing from her studio in the background. "Xavier, hey, what's up? Did you get a heater fine?" Her expression darkened. "Yes, $50 for trying not to freeze to death. Are you here to commiserate or organize?" "Organize." I explained the plan. Alina's eyes lit up. "Oh, this is perfect. Brenda's been bragging about how important this budget meeting is. She told me personally that she's expecting a full board turnout plus representatives from the management company. In February, in that drafty meeting room." "Is the room really that drafty?" "It's terrible. The windows are original from the 80s and they never updated them. Without the supplemental heat from our units, it'll be barely 60 degrees in there, even with the baseboards running full blast." "So you're in?" 100%. "When do we flip the switches?" "Day of the meeting, around noon." That'll give the room time to cool down, but not enough time for anyone to notice and fix it before the meeting starts. Marcus texted me that evening. Tom was in. Apparently, Tom had been fined 3 times in the past 2 months for various ridiculous infractions, including parking his car facing the wrong direction in his own driveway. He was ready for some payback. The next few days crawled by. I paid the $50 fine online because I didn't want to give Brenda any ammunition against me. The others did the same. We needed to appear compliant, just regular homeowners who had learned our lesson. On Wednesday evening, I got an email from the HOA announcing that the budget meeting would be starting at 7 p.m. sharp, and that all homeowners were encouraged to attend. The email included an agenda that was packed with financial reports, proposed rule changes, and a presentation from the management company about upcoming maintenance projects. It was going to be a long meeting. Thursday morning, I worked from home, answering emails and sitting through video conferences while watching the clock. At noon exactly, I texted the group chat. Time. 3 responses came back immediately. Ready. Let's do this. For justice. I went down to my basement where the HVAC system hummed away. The valve was exactly where the documentation said it would be, a red-handled wheel valve on a duct branch that led toward the community center. I turned it clockwise until it stopped, shutting off the flow of heated air. The change was subtle. My own heating system actually became slightly more efficient since it wasn't compensating for the shared duct anymore. The temperature in my unit, if anything, became more stable. I went back upstairs and tried to focus on work, but I kept checking the clock. At 5 p.m., I decided to take a walk past the community center, just to see if anyone had noticed anything. The parking lot was empty except for Brenda's silver Lexus. Through the windows, I could see her inside the meeting room, setting up chairs and arranging papers on the main table. She was wearing a purple blazer and a pearl necklace, her blonde hair styled in that aggressive bob that seemed to be a requirement for HOA presidents nationwide. I walked past casually, hands in my pockets. The sun was already setting, and the temperature was dropping fast. It was supposed to be one of the coldest nights of the year, with temperatures plummeting to single digits by midnight. At 6:45, I bundled up in my warmest coat and headed over to the community center. Other residents were already arriving, most of them looking confused about why they were voluntarily leaving their warm homes to attend an HOA meeting in the middle of winter. I stepped inside the building. The lobby area was warm enough, heated by its own independent system. But as I walked toward the meeting room, I could feel the temperature drop. By the time I entered the room itself, I could see my breath. It was glorious. Brenda stood at the front of the room, her arms crossed, looking severely annoyed. She had set up about 40 chairs, and maybe 20 residents had shown up, all of them keeping their coats on. The management company representatives, 2 men in suits, were huddled together near the door, clearly questioning their life choices. Marcus caught my eye from across the room and gave me the tiniest nod. Alina was sitting near the back, her expression perfectly neutral. Tom had positioned himself near the thermostat, which I could see was showing 58 degrees. Brenda clapped her hands together. "All right, everyone, let's get started. I know it's a bit chilly in here. Maintenance is looking into the heating issue." One of the management company reps, a balding man with glasses, raised his hand. "Brenda, maybe we should reschedule. This temperature isn't really conducive to a productive meeting." "Nonsense, Gerald. We have important business to discuss. Everyone just keep your coats on. We'll get through this quickly." Gerald did not look convinced, but he sat down anyway. Brenda launched into her opening remarks, discussing the financial state of the association, upcoming projects, and her vision for the community. Within 10 minutes, she was visibly shivering, her words coming out slightly clipped as she tried to control her chattering teeth. The meeting room had large windows that looked out over the courtyard. They were single pane, just as Alina had said, and I could feel cold air radiating off them even from where I sat in the middle of the room. The baseboards were working overtime, making clicking and hissing sounds, but they were fighting a losing battle against the combination of the poorly insulated windows and the complete lack of supplemental heat from the residential units. By the time Brenda got to the budget breakdown, people were starting to fidget. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman from the East Building, raised her hand. "Brenda, dear, I really think we should continue this another time. It's absolutely freezing in here." "We're almost done, Mrs. Patterson. Just bear with me." But we weren't almost done. We were barely a third of the way through the agenda. The detailed budget presentation alone was supposed to take 45 minutes. Gerald stood up. "Brenda, I'm sorry, but this is unreasonable. The temperature is still dropping. We need to either fix the heat or reschedule." Brenda's face was turning red, either from cold or frustration or both. "The heat is running. You can hear the baseboards. The room is just taking some time to warm up. Tom spoke up from near the thermostat. It's 56 degrees in here now. It's actually getting colder. Brenda shot him a venomous look. Thank you, Tom. I'm sure maintenance will have it sorted out shortly, but maintenance didn't show up. Of course they didn't. There was nothing wrong with the meeting room's heating system. The baseboards were functioning perfectly. The problem was that the supplemental heat that the room desperately needed wasn't flowing from the connected residential units. 20 minutes later, the temperature had dropped to 54 degrees. People were shifting constantly in their seats, trying to stay warm. Brenda had wrapped a scarf around herself and was soldiering on, but her presentation was suffering. She kept losing her place in her notes, her fingers too cold to properly turn the pages. Finally, Gerald stood up again. That's it, I'm calling it. This meeting needs to be rescheduled. This is a liability issue at this point. Other people nodded and started standing up. Brenda looked panicked. Wait, we still need to vote on the new parking regulations, and the landscaping budget. And the schedule another meeting, Brenda, Gerald said firmly. When the heat is working properly. People filed out quickly, everyone eager to get back to their warm homes. I kept my expression neutral as I left, nodding politely to Brenda as I passed. She looked like she was about to cry from frustration. Outside, Marcus fell into step beside me as we walked back toward our units. That was beautiful, he whispered. It's not over yet, I replied. The next morning I got an email from Brenda. It was sent to all residents and was titled Emergency Maintenance Notice. The email explained that the meeting room had experienced a heating malfunction, and that maintenance would be inspecting all the connected systems over the next few days. Residents of Units 36, 39, 42, and 47 should expect a maintenance visit to inspect their HVAC connections to the community center. I called Marcus immediately. Did you see the email? Yeah, what do we do? Nothing. We don't have to let them in without notice. Check your lease terms. I pulled up my own paperwork. According to the HOA bylaws, maintenance had to provide at least 48 hours notice before entering a unit, except in cases of emergency. A cold meeting room didn't qualify as an emergency, not when the actual heating system in that room was functioning properly. I replied to Brenda's email with a polite message saying that I would need to receive a formal 48-hour notice before allowing access to my unit, as per the bylaws. Within an hour, Marcus, Alina, and Tom had sent similar messages. Brenda called me directly that afternoon. Mr. Barrett, we need to inspect your heating system. That's fine, Brenda. Just send me the proper notice as outlined in Section 12 of the HOA bylaws, and I'll be happy to accommodate maintenance. This is an urgent situation. The meeting room is unusable. The meeting room's heating system is working fine. I walked past there this morning and the baseboards were running. If there's an issue with the room temperature, maybe it's an insulation problem. Have you considered upgrading those old windows? There was a long pause. Mr. Barrett, are you refusing maintenance access? Not at all. I'm asking for the proper notice period as required by the bylaws that you, as HOA president, are supposed to uphold. Send me the notice, and I'll schedule a time for maintenance to come by. She hung up without saying goodbye. The formal notices arrived via email that evening, scheduling maintenance visits for Monday morning. That gave us the weekend to strategize. We met at Alina's place on Saturday afternoon. She had made coffee, and we sat in her living room, which was decorated with her artwork, abstract paintings in bold colors that somehow made the space feel both energetic and calming. So they're coming Monday, Alina said. What's the play? We let them in, I said. There's nothing they can find. The valves are supposed to be there. We're allowed to close them. Tom frowned. Are we, though? I mean, is there anything in the HOA rules about maintaining the shared heating? That was a good question. I had spent most of Friday evening reading through every single page of the HOA bylaws, rules, and regulations. There's nothing specific about the valves. The only relevant section talks about not making unauthorized modifications to shared systems. But we didn't modify anything. We just turned a valve that's part of the standard system design. What about the part where our units are supposed to contribute to heating the meeting room? Marcus asked. That's where it gets interesting, I said. The original building plans show the shared heating system, but there's no actual requirement in any of the HOA documents that we have to run it. I think it was just a cost-saving measure when they built the place, and nobody ever formalized it into the rules. Alina leaned back on her couch. So legally, we're in the clear. Legally, yes, but Brenda's going to lose her mind. Good, Tom said flatly. After she fined me for parking in my own driveway, I'm not feeling particularly sympathetic. Monday morning arrived cold and gray. The maintenance supervisor, a tired-looking man named Dave, knocked on my door at 9 a.m. sharp. Brenda was with him, wearing another power suit, this one in navy blue. Mr. Barrett, she said curtly. Brenda, Dave, come on in. I led them down to the basement. Dave pulled out a flashlight and started inspecting the ductwork while Brenda stood with her arms crossed, watching me like she expected me to confess to something. Dave found the valve within about 30 seconds. He turned to Brenda. The valve's closed. Can you open it? She demanded. Dave looked uncomfortable. I mean, I can physically turn it, but this is part of Mr. Barrett's personal HVAC system. I can't just change settings without the homeowner's permission. Mr. Barrett, Brenda turned to me, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Would you mind if Dave opened this valve? Actually, I would mind. I closed it because my heating bills were too high. With the valve open, I'm essentially heating the community center on my own dime. The adjustment on our bills for the shared system is inadequate. This was technically true. I had checked my utility bills from before and after closing the valve. My gas costs had dropped by about 8%. The shared heating system is part of the community infrastructure, Brenda said. Show me where in the bylaws it says I'm required to keep that valve open. She couldn't, because no such requirement existed. Her face turned red as she pulled out her phone and started scrolling through documents. Dave stood there awkwardly, clearly wanting to be anywhere else. After 5 minutes of searching, Brenda looked up. This will be addressed at the next board meeting. You're obligated to maintain shared systems. The system is maintained. It's functioning perfectly. I'm just not using a feature that costs me money. That's my right as a homeowner. We went through the same dance at Marcus's place, then Alina's, then Tom's. Each time, Brenda became more frustrated and Dave became more uncomfortable. By the time they left Tom's unit, Brenda was practically vibrating with rage. The emergency board meeting was called for Wednesday evening. I received the notice Tuesday morning, along with a strongly worded email about community responsibility and shared obligations. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. in the meeting room, the same meeting room that we were still keeping at sub 60 degrees. Wednesday was even colder than the previous week, with temperatures barely reaching 20 during the day. I went to work as usual, spending my day in back-to-back meetings that made the hours blur together. By the time I got home at 6, it was already dark and the wind was howling. I debated whether to attend the board meeting. Part of me wanted to stay home and let Brenda freeze in her own stubbornness, but I was also curious to see how this would play out. At 7 p.m., I walked into the community center. The meeting room was, if anything, even colder than before. The board members were all there. Brenda, the Vice President Richard Lawson, the Treasurer Patricia Walsh, and the Secretary Kyle Morrison. They were seated at the main table, all wearing heavy coats and looking miserable. About a dozen residents had shown up, probably out of morbid curiosity more than anything else. Marcus and Alina were there. Tom had positioned himself in the back corner, his arms crossed. Brenda called the meeting to order with shaking hands. "Thank you all for coming. We're here to discuss a serious matter affecting the community center and the comfort of all residents." She launched into a speech about community responsibility and how the shared heating system was designed to benefit everyone. She talked about property values and neighborhood solidarity. She never once mentioned the ridiculous heater fines that had started this whole mess. When she finally stopped to take a breath, I raised my hand. "Yes, Mr. Barrett," she said icily. I stood up. "Brenda, I have a question. Why are we having this emergency meeting about the meeting room temperature, but nobody called an emergency meeting when you started fining residents for running their heaters during sub-zero weather?" A murmur went through the small crowd. Other people started nodding. "That's a separate issue," Brenda said. "The environmental aesthetic standards were properly voted on by the board. At a meeting held at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday when most residents couldn't attend," Marcus called out. "And the vote was 3-1, Alina added. "Which means only one board member had to agree with you, Brenda." Patricia Walsh, the treasurer, shifted uncomfortably. She was a quiet woman in her 50s who rarely spoke up at meetings. "Actually, I voted against those standards. I thought they were impractical." Brenda shot her a look that could have frozen water. The vote passed nonetheless. Richard Lawson, the vice president, cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should consider revisiting the environmental aesthetic standards. They have been somewhat controversial." "That's not what we're here to discuss," Brenda snapped. "We're here to address the heating situation and require residents to reopen their HVAC valves." "You can't require that," I said. "There's nothing in the bylaws that mandates it." "Then we'll amend the bylaws." "That requires a vote of all homeowners, not just the board. And good luck getting that passed when you're trying to force people to pay higher utility bills for your convenience." The meeting devolved from there. Other residents started voicing complaints about the heater fines, and someone brought up the wind chime ban. And then Mrs. Patterson went on a 5-minute rant about the doormat color restrictions. Brenda tried to maintain control, but she had lost the room. People were angry, cold, and fed up. Finally, Gerald from the management company stood up. He had been sitting quietly in the corner, taking notes. "I think it's clear that there are some governance issues here that need to be addressed. Brenda, I'm recommending that the board hold a special election to revisit some of these recent policy changes. And I'm also recommending that we reschedule this meeting to a warmer location." "This is our meeting room," Brenda protested. "We shouldn't have to, Brenda. It's 53 degrees in here. This is not acceptable. We're done for tonight." People filed out gratefully. As I was leaving, Patricia Walsh caught up to me in the parking lot. "Mr. Barrett, can I talk to you for a moment?" "Sure." She glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "Look, I know what you're doing with the heating valves. I can't say I blame you. Brenda's been out of control lately. Those heater fines were absurd. I'm just trying to keep my utility bills down," I said carefully. "Right, of course." She smiled slightly. "For what it's worth, I'm going to propose repealing the environmental aesthetic standards at the next board meeting. I think I can get Richard and Kyle to vote with me. That would override Brenda. That would be appreciated. And between you and me, keep those valves closed until it happens. Brenda needs to learn that she can't just steamroll the entire community." The next few days were quiet. I kept expecting another angry email from Brenda, but nothing came. Marcus told me that he had heard through the gossip chain that Brenda had tried to get the management company to force us to open the valves. But Gerald had refused, citing the lack of any legal requirement. The following Monday, I received a notice about an emergency board meeting scheduled for that Thursday. The agenda had exactly one item: revision of environmental aesthetic standards. This time, the meeting was held in the community center lobby, which had its own independent heating system and was actually comfortable. A large crowd showed up, at least 40 residents, all eager to see Brenda get taken down a peg. Patricia called the meeting to order. Brenda looked furious at being relegated to a side chair instead of leading the proceedings. "Thank you all for coming," Patricia said. "We're here to vote on repealing the environmental aesthetic standards that were enacted last month. These are the standards that limited visible exhaust vapor from residential heating units." "I move to repeal," Richard said immediately. "I second," Kyle added. All in favor, 3 hands went up. Patricia, Richard, and Kyle opposed. Brenda's hand shot up, but she was alone. The motion passes. The environmental aesthetic standards are repealed, effective immediately. Patricia looked directly at Brenda. "All fines issued under these standards will be refunded to affected residents within 30 days. The room erupted in applause. Brenda stood up and walked out without a word, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. I waited until the next morning to reopen my heating valve. Marcus, Elena, and Tom did the same. By that afternoon, the meeting room was back to a comfortable temperature. I thought that was the end of it. I really did. But I had underestimated Brenda's vindictiveness and her complete inability to admit when she was wrong. 2 weeks later, I got a notice of violation for unauthorized modification of community infrastructure. The fine was $500. The notice claimed that by closing my HVAC valve, I had damaged the shared heating system and endangered community property. I called Marcus immediately. He had gotten the same notice. So had Elena and Tom. "This is insane," Marcus said. "We didn't modify anything. We turned a valve." "A valve that's supposed to be there." "She's retaliating," I said. "This is pure retaliation because we made her look bad." I drafted a formal response to the HOA board, citing the bylaws and explaining that no modification had been made and no damage had occurred. I included photos of the valve system, documentation of the building's original design, and a breakdown of how the shared heating was a voluntary feature, not a mandatory requirement. Marcus, Elena, and Tom sent similar responses. The board meeting to address our appeals was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, I started doing research. I looked into HOA law in Wisconsin, contacted a real estate attorney for a consultation, and joined several online forums for homeowners dealing with difficult HOAs. What I learned was both encouraging and disturbing. Encouraging because Brenda was clearly in the wrong and we had a strong case. Disturbing because HOA disputes could drag on for months or even years, costing thousands in legal fees even when you won. The attorney I consulted, a sharp woman named Michelle Barnes, was blunt in her assessment. "You'll win if you fight this. The bylaws are clear, and there's no requirement for you to keep that valve open. But Brenda Hutchinson sounds like the type who will make your life hell in the meantime. She can't legally fine you for this, but she can probably find other violations to go after you for. HOA presidents with a vendetta can be very creative. So, what do you recommend? Honestly, try to get her removed. If she's abusing her power like this, she's probably vulnerable to a recall election. Check your bylaws for the procedure." I thanked her and spent that evening reading through the recall election procedures in our HOA documents. It required a petition signed by 30% of homeowners, followed by a vote. If a majority voted for removal, the board member would be immediately replaced. There were 96 units in Riverside Meadows. We would need signatures from 29 homeowners to trigger a recall election. I called Marcus, Alina, and Tom, and we met at my place that weekend to strategize. We made a list of every resident we knew who had been fined or bothered by Brenda's excessive rules. The list was longer than I expected. Apparently, Brenda had been busy. Over the next 2 weeks, we went door to door collecting signatures. Most people signed immediately, eager to share their own horror stories about Brenda. Mrs. Patterson signed, and then told us about how Brenda had threatened to fine her for having a bird feeder because it attracted pest animals. A young couple in the West Building signed and explained that they had been fined for having a baby stroller visible on their porch. Someone else had been cited for having the wrong shade of white paint on their window trim. By the end of the second week, we had 47 signatures. We submitted the petition to the management company, and Gerald confirmed that it met all the requirements for a recall election. The election was scheduled for 6 weeks later, with voting to take place over a 3-day period. Homeowners could vote in person at the community center or submit a ballot by mail. Brenda did not take this well. She sent out a series of increasingly unhinged emails defending her record and attacking those of us who had organized the recall petition. She claimed we were trying to destroy the community and ruin property values. She accused us of being troublemakers who refused to follow reasonable rules. But her emails only seemed to harden people's resolve. Every time she sent one, a few more homeowners would reach out to express their support for the recall. The week before the election, things took a strange turn. I came home from work to find that my assigned parking spot had been painted over with a bright red X. A new sign declared it a fire lane and warned that vehicles parked there would be towed. My parking spot was nowhere near any fire hydrant or emergency access route. It was in the middle of a regular parking lot, surrounded by other residential spaces. I took photos and called the non-emergency police line to confirm that there was no actual fire code issue with my spot. The dispatcher checked with the fire marshal's office and confirmed that my parking spot was not designated as a fire lane in any official capacity. Armed with this information, I parked in my spot anyway. The next morning, my car was gone. I called the towing company listed on the sign. They confirmed they had towed my vehicle on orders from the HOA and that I would need to pay $350 to retrieve it. That was when I stopped trying to be reasonable. I called the police and filed a report for illegal towing. The officer who took my statement was sympathetic, but explained that these situations were complicated because HOAs technically had the right to enforce parking rules. However, since the fire lane designation was fraudulent, it might constitute illegal towing. I also called the towing company back and explained that the fire lane was not legitimate and that I had documentation from the fire marshal's office. The dispatcher put me on hold for 10 minutes, then came back and said they would release my vehicle without charge and that they would be contacting the HOA about the situation. Then I called Michelle Barnes, the attorney. She did what? Michelle sounded equal parts amused and appalled. I explained the situation. Is this illegal? Oh yeah, this is potentially criminal depending on how you want to pursue it. At minimum, it's abuse of authority and possibly harassment. You could file a complaint with the state licensing board that oversees HOAs, or you could press charges for the fraudulent towing. You could also sue for damages. What would you recommend? Wait until after the recall election. If she's removed, this becomes a moot point. If she's not removed, then we go nuclear. But document everything. Save all emails, take photos, keep records. If this goes to court, we want to show a pattern of harassment. The recall election began on a Tuesday. I voted first thing in the morning, dropping my ballot in the box at the community center. The turnout was heavy, with a steady stream of residents coming through all day. Marcus had taken a vacation day to volunteer as an election observer, making sure everything was conducted fairly. He texted me updates throughout the day. Huge turnout, way more than normal board elections. Brenda's been sitting in the corner glaring at everyone who comes in. Mrs. Patterson just told Brenda off in the middle of the voting room. It was epic. By Thursday evening, when the voting period ended, 73 of the 96 homeowners had cast ballots. That was a record turnout for Riverside Meadows. Gerald from the management company oversaw the vote counting, which was done in the meeting room with observers from both sides present. I was there representing the recall effort, while Brenda had brought her husband, a quiet man who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Gerald opened each ballot and read the vote aloud while two volunteers tallied the results. It quickly became clear which way the vote was going. By the time they were halfway through, Brenda stood up and walked out. The final count was 61 in favor of removal, 12 opposed. Brenda Hutchinson was no longer the president of the Riverside Meadows Homeowners Association. The board held an emergency meeting the next week to elect a new president. Patricia Walsh was chosen unanimously. One of her first acts was to formally rescind all of the fines that Brenda had issued in the past 3 months, including the $500 unauthorized modification fines that had started the recall effort. I thought that was finally the end of it. Brenda had been removed, the fines were rescinded, and we could all go back to living our lives in peace. But Brenda had one more card to play. 2 weeks after her removal, the HOA bank account was missing $32,000. Patricia discovered it when she was reviewing the financials. The money had been transferred out in a series of transactions over the previous 10 days, all authorized by Brenda's login credentials. The transfers had gone to various accounts, making it difficult to trace. Patricia called an emergency board meeting and notified the management company. Gerald took one look at the transaction records and immediately advised calling the police. The Milwaukee Police Department sent 2 detectives to interview the board members. I was brought in as a witness since I had been heavily involved in the recall effort and might have information about Brenda's state of mind. Detective Sarah Morrison was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who listened carefully as Patricia explained the missing money and the timeline of events. When she heard about the recall election and Brenda's increasingly erratic behavior leading up to it, she nodded. "This sounds like retaliation. We'll need to bring Miss Hutchinson in for questioning. Do you know where she is?" "She still lives in the community," Patricia said. "Unit 78. The detectives went to Brenda's unit that afternoon. I heard about it later from Marcus, who had witnessed the whole thing from his window. Apparently, Brenda had denied everything, claimed she had no idea how the money had disappeared, and suggested that Patricia must have made an accounting error. But the transaction logs didn't lie. Every transfer had been made using Brenda's credentials from her home IP address. The detectives obtained a warrant for her computer and financial records. It took 3 weeks for the investigation to conclude. During that time, rumors swirled around Riverside Meadows. Some people thought Brenda had gambled the money away. Others speculated that she had transferred it to a secret account and was planning to flee the country. The truth turned out to be more mundane and somehow sadder. Brenda had taken the money to pay off personal debts. She and her husband had been struggling financially for months. She had maxed out their credit cards and taken out loans they couldn't afford. When she lost the HOA presidency, she panicked and decided that the association owed her for all her hard work and dedication. She was arrested on charges of embezzlement and theft. The bail was set at $50,000, which she couldn't afford. She sat in jail for a week before her husband managed to scrape together enough for a bail bondsman. The court date was set for 3 months later. In the meantime, the HOA had to figure out how to recover the stolen money. The association had insurance that covered some of the loss, but there was still a significant shortfall. Patricia worked with Gerald and the management company to create a recovery plan that wouldn't require raising HOA fees. I attended Brenda's court hearing on a gray morning in May. The winter cold had finally broken, and Milwaukee was coming alive with spring colors. It felt strange to be sitting in a courtroom, watching the woman who had caused so much chaos finally face consequences for her actions. Brenda looked small and defeated in her court-appointed clothes. Her husband sat in the gallery, his head in his hands. The prosecutor laid out the case methodically. The embezzlement, the pattern of harassment leading up to it, the abuse of authority. Brenda's public defender tried to argue that she had been under extreme stress and had made a terrible mistake. The judge was not sympathetic. "Miss Hutchinson, you were in a position of trust. You were elected by your community to manage their funds and their welfare. Instead, you abused that trust systematically. You harassed residents. You issued fraudulent fines, and when you lost your position, you stole from the very people who had trusted you." Brenda was sentenced to 2 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 1 year. She was also ordered to repay the full amount of the stolen money with interest. Given her financial situation, that repayment would probably take decades. As I left the courthouse, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief that it was finally over, satisfaction that justice had been served, but also a kind of sadness for how completely Brenda had destroyed her own life. Patricia proved to be an excellent HOA president. Her first major initiative was to review all of the rules and regulations that Brenda had implemented and repeal the ones that were excessive or unreasonable. The wind chime ban was lifted. The doormat color restrictions were eliminated. The package delivery time limit was extended to a much more reasonable 24 hours. She also organized a community meeting to discuss how to prevent another situation like Brenda's from occurring. The homeowners voted to implement several new safeguards. All fines over $50 now required approval from the full board, not just the president. Financial transactions over $5,000 required 2 signatures. Board meetings had to be scheduled at times when working residents could reasonably attend. Perhaps most importantly, the homeowners voted to add language to the bylaws explicitly stating that residents had the right to control their own utility usage, including the right to close HVAC valves or adjust heating systems as they saw fit, as long as no actual damage was caused to shared infrastructure. My heating bills stayed lower for the rest of the winter. I kept the valve closed, and the meeting room managed just fine with the supplemental heat from the 3 other connected units. Eventually, the board voted to upgrade the meeting room with a new, independent heating system and better insulated windows. The cost was spread out over 2 years to minimize the impact on HOA fees. Marcus and I became good friends through the whole ordeal. We started a weekly tradition of grabbing beers at a bar down the street, where we would talk about work, sports, and occasionally reminisce about the great HOA rebellion of winter. Alina joined us sometimes, and once she brought Tom, who turned out to be hilarious once you got a few drinks in him. The community center meeting room became a popular gathering place once it was properly heated. Patricia organized monthly social events, movie nights, potluck dinners, holiday parties. The meeting room that had been the site of so much conflict became a place where neighbors actually connected with each other. I ran into Mrs. Patterson at the mailboxes one afternoon in June. She was wearing a wide-brimmed hat, decorated with plastic flowers, and was in remarkably good spirits. "Mr. Barrett, I wanted to thank you." "Thank me? For what?" "For standing up to Brenda. I know it wasn't easy, and I know it took a lot of courage, but you made this community better. We needed someone willing to fight back against all that nonsense." "I just wanted to run my heater without getting fined," I said, feeling embarrassed. "Well, you did a lot more than that. You reminded everyone that we own our homes and we have rights. That's important." I thought about that conversation a lot over the following weeks. When I had first closed that heating valve, I had been acting out of petty revenge, annoyed about a ridiculous fine and eager to make Brenda uncomfortable. I never intended to start a movement or fight for homeowners' rights. But sometimes the smallest acts of resistance can snowball into something much bigger. By simply refusing to accept an unjust rule, by standing up for my right to control my own utilities, I had accidentally sparked a community-wide reckoning with an abusive authority figure. The story spread beyond Riverside Meadows. A local news station picked it up as a human interest piece about HOA overreach. I declined to be interviewed on camera, but several other residents participated, including Mrs. Patterson, who gave a wonderfully rambling interview about the importance of bird feeders and personal freedom. The attention led to some changes at the state level. A legislator from Milwaukee introduced a bill to strengthen homeowner protections against HOA abuse and create a state oversight board to investigate complaints. I don't know if the bill will pass, but it's encouraging that people are paying attention to these issues. As for me, I settled back into my normal life. Work continued to be busy but manageable. My townhouse remained comfortable and warm, with heating bills that stayed reasonable now that I wasn't involuntarily heating the community center. I even started attending the monthly board meetings, not because I expected any drama, but because I had learned the importance of staying engaged with community governance. Patricia did an excellent job managing the association. Under her leadership, Riverside Meadows became the kind of community that the marketing brochures had always promised it would be. Friendly, well-maintained, and governed by common sense rather than petty tyranny. One evening in August, I was sitting on my small patio, enjoying the summer weather and reading a book, when Marcus came over with a 6-pack of beer. "Thought you might want some company," he said. "Always." I grabbed 2 bottles from the pack and opened them. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sun set over the courtyard. "You ever think about how crazy last winter was?" Marcus asked. "Sometimes. It feels like it happened to someone else. I still can't believe we brought down an HOA president by turning off a heating valve." I laughed. "When you put it that way, it does sound absurd. But it worked. That's the wild part. It actually worked." We clinked our bottles together. In the courtyard, some kids were playing, their laughter carrying on the warm breeze. Somewhere nearby, I could hear wind chimes, the gentle sound that Brenda had once banned as too disruptive. Mrs. Patterson's bird feeder hung from her patio, attracting cardinals and finches. Someone had parked their car in the lot facing the wrong direction, and no one cared. The community center lights came on as dusk settled in. Through the windows, I could see people setting up for what looked like a birthday party in the meeting room. The room that had once been the coldest, most miserable place in the complex was now properly heated and full of life. I thought about Brenda sometimes, sitting in her prison cell, paying the price for her pride and her crimes. I didn't feel vindictive about it anymore. Mostly, I just felt grateful that things had worked out, that the community had survived her reign and emerged stronger. You know what's funny? I said to Marcus, if she had just listened when we complained about those heater fines, none of this would have happened. She'd still be HOA president. The money would still be in the bank. She'd be free. Pride goes before a fall, Marcus said. Or in this case, pride goes before embezzlement charges. We stayed out there until the stars came out, talking about nothing important, enjoying the simple pleasure of a summer evening with a friend. Life in Riverside Meadows had returned to normal, or maybe it had finally become normal for the first time. The heating valve in my basement remained closed. I had opened it briefly after the new meeting room heating system was installed, just to test it, then closed it again. It was my right as a homeowner to control my own utilities and my own expenses. That simple principle had seemed so obvious to me from the beginning, but it had taken a small war to establish it. Sometimes I walked past the community center and glanced at the meeting room, remembering that frigid February night when Brenda had tried to hold a budget meeting in 53-degree temperatures. The memory still made me smile. It had been petty and childish, yes, but it had also been necessary. Some battles need to be fought, even when they start over something as simple as condensation from a heater exhaust. The next HOA board election was scheduled for November. Patricia was running for re-election, and she was unopposed. The board positions that Richard and Kyle held were also up for election, and several residents had expressed interest in running. For the first time since I had moved to Riverside Meadows, people were actually engaged with their HOA, actually paying attention to the governance of their community. That engagement was probably the most important outcome of the whole situation. Brenda had been able to abuse her power because most residents were apathetic, too busy with their own lives to pay attention to HOA meetings or policy changes. But after everything that had happened, people had learned the hard way that paying attention mattered. In September, I got a letter from Brenda's attorney. It was a formal apology, probably written as part of some plea arrangement or parole consideration. The language was stiff and legal, expressing regret for any distress caused by her actions as HOA president. It didn't feel genuine, and I didn't really care. The apology didn't change anything. The damage had been done and the consequences had been paid. I filed the letter away and forgot about it. October brought cooler weather and the first hints of the approaching winter. I checked my heating system, had the furnace serviced, and made sure everything was in good working order. When the first cold snap hit in early November, my heater kicked on smoothly, filling my townhouse with comfortable warmth. The exhaust from my heater created white vapor clouds in the cold air, condensation forming as the hot air met the freezing temperatures. It was completely normal, a simple byproduct of physics and chemistry. And it was perfectly legal because the environmental aesthetic standards that had started this whole mess were gone, repealed, erased from the HOA regulations. I stood in my driveway one morning, watching the vapor drift from the exhaust vent, and thought about how something so innocent had become the catalyst for so much chaos. If Brenda hadn't decided that water vapor was visually polluting, none of this would have happened. I would have kept paying my HOA fees, attending the occasional meeting, and living my quiet life without conflict. But she had decided to fine me for running my heater, and I had decided to stop heating the meeting room. And from those two small decisions, An entire drama had unfolded, ending with an HOA president in prison and a community transformed. The annual holiday party was held in mid-December in the community center. Patricia had organized it, and the turnout was impressive, with at least 60 residents showing up. The meeting room was decorated with lights and garland, and someone had set up a projector to play classic Christmas movies on the wall. Tables were loaded with food that people had brought, everything from cookies to casseroles to exotic dishes representing the diverse backgrounds of the community. I brought a cheese and cracker platter, nothing fancy, and spent the evening talking to neighbors I hadn't really connected with before. It struck me how much had changed in less than a year. This time last year, most of us had been strangers, united only by our shared addresses and our shared irritation with Brenda's rules. Now we actually felt like a community. Mrs. Patterson cornered me near the dessert table, her plate piled high with cookies. "This is nice, isn't it? A proper community celebration. It really is." Brenda never would have organized something like this. Too frivolous, she would have said, too much liability risk with all the food. Well, Patricia's doing a great job. She is. And you know what? The property values have actually gone up since all this happened. I checked with my real estate agent friend. Apparently, Riverside Meadows has a reputation now as a community that stands up for homeowners' rights. People want to live here. I found that ironic and kind of wonderful. Brenda had been obsessed with property values, using them to justify all her ridiculous rules. And in the end, it was the removal of those rules, the restoration of common sense governance, that actually improved property values. As the party wound down and people started heading home, I helped Patricia clean up. We worked in comfortable silence, packing away leftover food and taking down decorations. "Thank you," Patricia said suddenly, "for everything you did. I just turned off a heating valve." "You did a lot more than that. You stood up when most people would have just paid the fine and moved on. You organized people. You made them believe they could actually change things. I had a lot of help, true, but you started it. That matters." I thought about that as I walked home through the cold December night. Had I really started anything, or had I just been the spark that ignited frustrations that were already building? Brenda had been abusing her power for months, maybe longer. Eventually, someone would have pushed back. It just happened to be me, and it just happened to be over heater fines. But Patricia was right that it mattered. Someone had to be first. Someone had to say no, to draw a line, to refuse to accept the unacceptable. And once one person did it, others found the courage to join in. The winter passed without incident. The meeting room stayed warm, heated by its new independent system. My gas bills remained reasonable. Patricia ran the HOA with quiet competence, focusing on actual maintenance issues and community needs rather than manufactured problems and aesthetic obsessions. Brenda was released on parole after serving 11 months of her sentence. I heard through the gossip chain that she and her husband had moved out of Riverside Meadows immediately, relocating to a small apartment across town. I never saw her again. By the time spring arrived, the whole saga had become history, a story that longtime residents would tell newcomers as a cautionary tale about HOA overreach. The community had learned its lessons and implemented safeguards. Life had returned to normal, or more accurately, had achieved a new and better normal. I renewed my lease in April, committing to another year at Riverside Meadows. I had thought about moving after everything that had happened, but I realized I didn't want to leave. This was my home, and this was my community. We had fought for it together, and that shared struggle had created something valuable. On a warm evening in May, exactly 1 year after Brenda's court hearing, I was sitting on my patio again when Marcus came over, this time with a bottle of decent whiskey. "Anniversary," he said, pouring 2 glasses. "Anniversary of what?" "The end of the reign of terror. The victory of common sense. The great heating valve rebellion of Riverside Meadows." I laughed and raised my glass. "To heating valves and property rights. To standing up for yourself even when it seems petty. To communities that actually function like communities." We drank, and the whiskey was smooth and warm. Around us, Riverside Meadows lived and breathed, a collection of townhouses and people who had learned to work together, to stand up for each other, and to reject tyranny in all its forms, even the petty tyranny of an HOA run amok. And in my basement, the heating valve that had started everything remained closed. A small mechanical reminder that sometimes the most important battles begin with the simplest acts of resistance. I had never planned to become an advocate for homeowners' rights or to lead a rebellion against HOA overreach. I had just wanted to run my heater without being fined. But that one decision, that simple refusal to accept an unjust rule, had changed everything. It had exposed corruption, brought down an abusive authority figure, and reminded an entire community that they had power when they chose to use it. The story could have ended so many different ways. I could have just paid the fine and forgotten about it. Brenda could have listened to complaints and rescinded the rule. The meeting room could have stayed cold without anyone caring. But none of those things happened. Instead, we got the story we got, messy and complicated and ultimately satisfying. As the sun set and Marcus and I finished our whiskey, I thought about all the homeowners in all the communities across America who were dealing with their own versions of Brenda, their own ridiculous rules and excessive fines. I hoped some of them would find the courage to push back, to say no, to close their own metaphorical heating valves and force change. Because change is possible. Authority can be challenged. Communities can be reclaimed. All it takes is one person willing to stand up and say that enough is enough. And sometimes, just sometimes, that one person can be someone as ordinary as a guy in Milwaukee who just wanted to keep his townhouse warm without breaking the bank. The lights in the community center came on as evening settled in. Through the windows, I could see a yoga class in session, people moving through poses in the properly heated meeting room. Life went on, better than before, stronger than before. And somewhere in my basement, a closed heating valve stood as a tiny monument to the power of saying no to injustice, no matter how small that injustice might seem.